We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma, Daf 104a. On the previous summit, the Gemara is trying to identify the Tana of the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, it says that if a person takes a false oath about money that he stole, and then he admits that he took a false oath, he has to pay back the principal and a fifth, and he also has to bring a carbon asham. And it says that in that situation, when he's paying back the principal, he has to follow the person all the way to Madai. He has to follow the nigzal all the way to Madai in order to return it directly to him. And the Gemara was asking who is the author of the Mishnah, and the Gemara suggested it might be Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon in general says that if a person stole from one of five people, he doesn't know exactly who he stole from, he doesn't have to return it directly to the specific person because he doesn't know. Instead, he just places it, so to speak, in front of the five individuals. And the Gemara says in that situation, that's when Rabbi Tarfon says he doesn't have to return it directly to the person. But perhaps when there is an oath, Rabbi Tarfon would say that you would have to follow the person, so to speak, all the way to Madai, and therefore Rabbi Tarfon could be the author of the Mishnah. But the Gemara then points out that according to Rabbi Tarfon, the halacha happens to be that if the person admits that he wants to return the money, he admits that he stole from one of these five people, he actually does have to return it to every single one of those five individuals. And so therefore in our Mishnah as well, in our Mishnah you can't have a case of a false oath and then paying the principal and a fifth and bringing carbon asham unless there's an admission after. So if there's already an admission, you don't even need the oath. So then you can't even say the answer we're giving. You can say that Rabbi Tarfon admits that in a situation of a false oath, you have to give it directly back to the person, because on the contrary, Rabbi Tarfon wouldn't even require the shvu in our Mishnah, because there's an admission, as the Gemara now says, shekvar hoda mipi atzma, once there's an admission, he has to return it actually to all five of the individuals, he has to return it directly to their hands. Rashi explains, shekvar hoda mipi atzma, there's already an admission. The point is, uba lotzeis yedei shamayim. The point is now he wants to be yotzei yedei shamayim, meaning the din of heaven. He wants to be yotzei, that he wants to actually do teshuvah. V'afagav de beidina lo matzu mechayvile. The point here is, even though a bezin can't be mechayiv him to return it to all five people, elaminiach lefneim, all he has to do is place it in front of them. Miu yedei onesh ein yotzei ad sheshalem l'shneim. Nevertheless, he doesn't get out of a punishment until he actually pays both of them. Let's say there's two individuals, the halav l'bayla mahadre, because otherwise he hasn't actually returned it to the original owner, and so then we have a problem saying that the Mishnah is Rabbi Tarfon as well. So who is the author of the Mishnah? And the Gemara continues, Ela Amar Rava, rather Rava says, Shani Masnisan, our Mishnah is different, meaning our Mishnah is different than the case of the machlokas Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. That machlokas was talking in a situation where the Gazlan steals from one of five people, and he doesn't know exactly who he stole from, but in our Mishnah he knows exactly who he stole from. The Kevan de Yodel Aman Gazle, since he knows who he stole from, V'yodile, and he admitted it to him. Kevan de Efshar La'adure Mamona Lamari, since it's possible to return the money to the actual owner, Havale Kamanda Amar Le Yuli B'yarcha. It's as if the original owner, the Nigzal, said to him, you keep it as a deposit until I'm able to get it back from you. And Hilkach, therefore we make the following distinction in the Mishnah according to everyone, according to Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Nishba, if he takes a false oath, Afal Gav de Kamar Le Yuli B'yarcha, even if the person says, the Nigzal says, you hold on to it until I get it, but still, Kevan de Boy Kapara, since in that situation where he took a false oath, he requires an atonement, Losagi Ademot Liyadi, it's not going to be sufficient until it actually reaches the Nigzal's hand. Haloish Dava, but if he didn't take a false oath, have a Gabe Pikadon, then it could be considered to be a Pikadon by the Gazlan, Adasi V'Shakale, until the original owner is able to come and take it from him. And Rashi explains, Zela Amar Rava, rather Rava says, Masnisan Divrei HaKoli, our Mishnah follows everyone. Velo Damya Le'ein Yodei, it's not similar to the case where you don't know exactly who you stole from. Dehasam Bein Nishba Bein Lo Nishba, who depligi Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, because there, whether there's an oath, whether there's no oath, there's going to be machlokas Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, Le'inyan Dina, in terms of what the halach is. Rabbi Tarfon L'Mechayiv L'Achzer L'Yad Nigzal. Rabbi Tarfon will not say you're chayiv to return it to the hands of the Nigzal. Again, Rabbi Tarfon said, Meiniach Lefneim, you leave it in front of them. Rabbi Akiva Mechayiv Afagav Delo Nishman. Rabbi Akiva says he is chayiv, even if it's not a situation of an oath. V'hai de parach la'el, and that which the Gemara asked before, they said it doesn't seem to follow either Tana. It said V'i Rabbi Akiva, that if we're following Rabbi Akiva, Afagav Delo Ishtab, it said Rabbi Akiva should hold that it has to go to the hands of the Nigzal, even if there was no oath. That's what we said in the previous one, and now we're saying that's not the case. Lav Pirchi, rather that's not actually a question. The Hasam Dinu, because there where you have no idea who you stole from, it makes sense to say that's the halacha. The Afagav Delo Mishtaba, even though there's no oath, the Yachzer L'chol Echad, you should have to return to each person. You should have to pay all five. Sharei Ein Yodei L'mi Gazal, because he doesn't know who he stole from. V'lo Nafik Yedei Shamayim Klal, he therefore hasn't fulfilled his obligation at all of returning it. Avol Hacha, but over here, B'Masnisan in our Mishnah, the Yada Laman Gazal, he knows who he stole from. Umodile, and he admits that he stole it. Mishas Hodad, the Mizuma From the moment that he admits and he's ready to return it, it's really just like a pikadon in his possession. He's holding it just like you would hold a deposit on behalf of someone else. And so therefore we do make a distinction between a case of a shvua and a case where there is no shvua, as the Gemara explains. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Lo yitein lo livno v'lo l'shlucho. He has to return it directly to the nigzal. He shouldn't give it to his son or his shliach or his agent. And the Gemara says, it was stated the following, machlokas amoroim. Shliach sha'aso be'edim. Let's say you have a shliach that was made by the nigzal. It was made in front of edim. We know this shliach was appointed by the nigzal to collect the item because there are edim that say the shliach was appointed by the nigzal. Rav Chisda Amar have a shliach. Rav Chisda said that's a good shliach, meaning to say you can return it to the shliach. In that case, you don't have to follow the nigzal all the way to Madai. And Rabba Amar lo have a shliach. Rabba says in that case is not considered to be a good shliach. Rashi explains, Shliach she'aso be'edim, again the Shliach was made with Edim, Ruvain sheyesh lo mos biyad Shimon, meaning Ruvain's owed money by Shimon, Umino Shliach be'edim lekavlom heimenu, and he appoints a Shliach with Edim to receive it from him. He doesn't need to get it directly, he's going to have the Shliach collect it, Unesanim lo, and then that's exactly what happens. He gives it to the Shliach, he doesn't give it directly to the person he owes the money, he gives it to the Shliach. Is that considered a good Shliach or not? Rav Chisda says it is a good Shliach, Rabba says it is not. Rav Chisda says, have a Shliach, that's a good Shliach. If there's some kind of onus on the way, Pater Balabais, the Balabais who gave it to the Shliach is Pater, he has fulfilled his halacha of Hashava. And we'll take a look at Tosas over here as well. We mentioned this Tosas briefly when we did the Mishnah. Shliach she'aso, if you have a Shliach made with Edim, l'chora nira, Tosas says it seems to be as follows. The Ayri could go into lo amar lo shalach li al yadu. The case over here is, the Nigzal never told the Gazlan to give it to the Shliach. He just appointed the Shliach with Edim. Rak Edim mi'idim she'aso Shliach. There's just Edim testifying that this guy is a Shliach. Avolim haya omer, but if he would say shalach li al yado, if the nigzal would tell the Gazlan, send it specifically, I want you to give it to the shliach, pshita dahav shliach. That's not even a question. That's obviously a shliach, and Tosas goes on to prove that that is the case. In other words, Tosas says if the Gazlan was told to give it to this person by the nigzal, that's a totally different story. That's shlucho shaladam kamoso. The question is if that did not happen, and all we have is the shliach was appointed with edim. So then, in that situation, is he absolved if he just gives it to the shliach? Rav Chisda says yes, it's sufficient to give it to the shliach. Rabba says no, and the Gemara now explains. Rav Chisda Amar have a shliach. Rav Chisda says that this is a good shliach. Lahachi tarchi v'ukmei be'edim. That's why he went to the bother of designating the shliach with witnesses to leiku b'reshusei. That way, it's considered like it's in his reshus. And Rabba says lo have a shliach. It's not a shliach. Hachi kamar. All he's really saying is as follows. Inish mehemnehu, this person I trust. Isamach samoch, if you want to rely on him, you rely on him. Ibois l'shadure biyad shadar biyad. If you want to send it with him, send it with him. But the moment it comes to him, that's not the end. It has to actually reach the nigzal. It's not sufficient to say I gave it to the shliach. You are actually, the Gazlan is actually relying on the shliach that the shliach will deliver it. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Hashoel asapara. If somebody borrows a cow, v'shilcha biad beno, biad avdo, biad shlucho, and then the person, the lender, sends it in the hands of his son, or the hands of his slave, or the hands of his shliach, or biad beno, biad avdo, biad shlucho, shel shoel. Let's say he sends it in the hand of the son, or the slave, or the agent of the shoel. V'meisen, it dies, putter. In that case, the shoel is going to be putter. The shoel didn't yet receive it. It's not really considered to be a shliach of the shoel. And the Gemara says, Hi shlucha hechidami. Well, what's the case where you're sending it with his agent? If the person didn't appoint the shliach with Edim, the shoel didn't appoint the shliach with Edim, so how do you even know this is the shliach of the shoel? Rather, it must be that he appointed the shliach with Edim, v'katani the pater. And it does say in this Mishnah that the shoel is pater. Apparently, is not considered to be his shliach. It doesn't make it that the shoel has actually received it. We're just saying send it with this particular shliach, and when it reaches the shoel is responsible. So kasha Rav Chisda, isn't that a difficulty against Rav Chisda? Rav Chisda said if a shliach is made with Edim, it's considered to be a shliach. And so the Gemara answers to that. Kedam Rav Chisda, it's like Rav Chisda said it in another context. We'll see it soon. Besechiro ulakito, we're talking about where he sends. It's not talking about a shliach that was made with Edim. It's his general employee, or it's his lakito. It's somebody who is his companion. Rashi will explain what lakito means. And so hachanam here also besechiro lakito. He's not giving it to someone who was appointed with Edim. A shliach that was appointed with Edim, according to Rav Chisda, is a shliach. But schiro lakito, that's not necessarily a shliach. It has to actually reach him. And Rashi explains, Lakito is shalokto etzlo lodur imo bebeso. He lives with him in the house. Latzavsa bialma, he's like a companion. Lashon Mori, that's my Rebbe's explanation, says Rashi. Usachiro means niskari moliyom, ulechodesh, ulashon l'shabbos. He's hired for a certain amount of time, a day, a month, a year, etc. Lishna achrin, another explanation of Lakito. Lakito is locate tvuah, so somebody who collects his crops for him. But in any case, that's not the same as a shliach is made with Eidim. We make a distinction between those cases. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Lo yitin lo livno v'lo l'shlucho. Again, you can't give it when he has to return it to the person's hands. It's not sufficient to give it to his son or to a shliach. And again, the Gemara says, Hai shlucho, hey chidami. What's the case of the Mishnah where he's giving it to the shliach where it's not sufficient? Ida lo aso be'edim. Now, if the shliach was not made with witnesses, menoyadin, how do we even know this is the shliach? That can't be the case. Elalav, rather than that, aso be'edim, that he made the shliach with edim, and apparently again, it's not considered to be a shliach. It's a question on Rav Chisda. And the Gemara says, Tir Gemara Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda answers, Beschir or Lakito, the same answer. We're talking about his hired worker, or we're talking about Lakito. That's a situation where it's not sufficient to give it to that shliach. But the Gemara says, but according to that, Aval shliach shaso be'edim, according to this answer of Rav Chisda, if you would have a shliach that was made with edim, then what would be the halacha? Hachanami to have a shliach. Apparently Rav Chisda would say in our Mishnah that is a good shliach to return it to, and once he gives it to the shliach, he's fulfilled his obligation of hashava. But if that's the case, we still have a problem with the Mishnah. Because Adatani Sefer, because instead of saying at the end of the Mishnah, Avol Nosin Hu L'Shliach Bezin, that he could give it to an agent of the court, well, you could have made a different distinction. Liflog V'Lisni B'Dida, we should have made that distinction within Shliach itself. Forget about Shliach Bezin. And we should have said Shliach Shaso Be'edim, Hachanami to have a Shliach. We should have said it's only true by a Shliach, not with Edim, but a Shliach that's made with Edim, that would be a good Shliach. That's what the Mishnah should have said if Rav Chisda is correct. And the Gemara continues, Amri, they say to that, lo psikole. They didn't want to make that distinction between a shliach shelo aso be'edim and a shliach shaso be'edim because that is not true across the board. Whereas by shliach bezin, it's true all the time. Meaning as follows, shliach bezin, when it comes to shliach bezdin, lo shna aso nigzal, it doesn't matter if the nigzal made the shliach bezin, v'lo shna aso gazlan, it doesn't matter if the gazlan made the shliach bezin, have a shliach is always going to be considered a good shliach. So psikole, that's true across the board, that's why the Mishnah wanted to discuss that. But shliach shaso be'edim, when it comes to a shliach that's made with witnesses, t'chiaso nigzal hu to have a shliach, that's only considered a shliach if the nigzal made the shliach. But aso gazlan, but if the gazlan made the shliach, even if the gazlan made the shliach in front of Edim, lo have a shliach, that wouldn't be a good shliach, so lo psikole, so it's not true across the board. That's why the Mishnah did not want to discuss that particular distinction. And the Gemara continues, Ulafuke mehai Tana. Our Mishnah then is different than the following Tana. The Tanyas we learned in a Brayser. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Shliach bezin shaso nigzal. If you have a Shliach bezin that was made by the nigzal, only if it's a Shliach bezin that was made by the nigzal is it considered good. V'lo aso gazlan, and that Shliach wasn't made by the gazlan. O aso gazlan, or if you have a Shliach bezin that was made by the gazlan, v'shalach halo v'natal shalo, then it's only okay if the nigzal comes directly and takes it from that Shliach miyado from his hand. Only in that situation, pater is it pater. But if the shliach bezin would be made by the gazlan, it would not be sufficient to just return it to that shliach bezin. That is different than the interpretation we gave in our Mishnah, where we say a shliach bezin is good across the board, whether made by the nigzal or by the gazlan. Rashi explains, Zulafuke mehaitana, hamas nisim, meaning our Mishnah, do kimna shliach bezin afilu aso gazlan velo nigzal, that we're saying in our Mishnah, a shliach bezin is sufficient even if it's made by the gazlan and not the nigzal, have a shliach, but that's considered a shliach, v'havi b'achrayusa the nigzal, and it's now in the responsibility of the nigzal. La'afuka mehai Tana, that's different than the following Tana, than Rav Shimon ben Elazar in the Braysa, because shliach bezin, when it talks about again Rav Shimon ben Elazar by shliach bezin, demashim asnisim demishanasan lo nifter gazlan. In the Mishnah, it sounds like if he gives it to him, then the gazlan is going to be potter. Kishaso nigzal ka'amar v'lo kishaso gazlan. According to Rav Shimon ben Elazar, that's only when the nigzal makes the shliach and not when the gazlan makes the shliach. V'shalach halo v'natal shalo, only if the nigzal comes and actually takes what's his miyada shliach from the shliach potter, only then is he potter. Me'onas haderech, then he's going to be potter if something then happens, if there's an onus on the road. And the point is, time de not al hanigzal. The only reason it's okay, according to Shimon ben Elazar, in a case where the shliach bezin was made by the gazlan, the only time it's sufficient is when the nigzal actually takes it and actually has it in his possession. Hanensu min hashliach harishon. But if there would be an onus with that first shliach, that shliach bezin that was made by the gazlan, chayiv, so then he would be chayiv. The gazlan would still be chayiv. It would not be considered a sufficient hashava. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar da Amri Tarvayu. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, they both say, Shliach shaso be'edim have a shliach, that if a shliach is made in front of Edim, it is a good shliach. V'yim tomer Mishnah Seinu, and if you're going to ask from our Mishnah, where our Mishnah says he can't give it to a shliach, he has to follow him all the way to Madai, that's not talking about a shliach that was made with Edim. Rather, that's talking about as follows, B'mamtzi lo shliach, the cases where he's actually providing for him a shliach. D'yamarle, because he says to him, Isli zuze gave planya, the Nigzal says to the shliach, I have some money, this person owes me some money. He's not sending the money. It's like go in front of him, appear in front of him. Maybe he just can't find someone to take the money, and then he'll give it to you. But in that situation, just giving it to you is not enough. I'm providing him a favor. I'm providing him something who can deliver the money on his behalf. But still, he will still be responsible until it actually reaches me, until it actually reaches the Nigzal. Inami, the Gemara says, or you can answer our Mishnah, like Rav Chisda explained earlier, the Mishnah is talking about a shliach that's just his hired worker, or it's talking about Lakito, again, either his companion or somebody who collects his crops. And the point is, those kinds of shluchim, you give it to them, they would not be considered a shliach. It would not be a sufficient hashava. But again, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, a shliach sha'aso be'edim would be considered a shliach. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda, Mar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video, on Daf Kuf Dalid Amud Beis.